July 14, 1944. A hedgerow outside St. Lo, Normandy. Staff Sergeant Thomas Harper crouched in the mud-slick ditch, his fingers working methodically through the contents of his combat vest. Around him, the air still smelled of cordite and wet earth from the morning's failed assault. 40 yards ahead, a German machine gun nest sat embedded in a reinforced log bunker, its firing slit angled perfectly to cover the only approach route. 2 squads had already tried. 14 men were casualties. The grenades they'd thrown had bounced off the logs like pebbles. Harper pulled 3 Mk2 fragmentation grenades from his webbing, then reached for the wire cutters in his pocket. What he was about to do violated every regulation in FM 2330. The Army's ordnance manual explicitly forbade modifying grenades. But doctrine hadn't saved the men bleeding out behind him. He twisted wire through the pin rings, binding the grenades into a single cluster, their pineapple-textured bodies pressed together like a crude bouquet of death. His platoon leader saw what he was doing and opened his mouth to object. Harper pulled the single pin, counted to 2, and rolled the makeshift device through the bunker's firing slit before anyone could stop him. The explosion didn't sound like 3 grenades. It sounded like the earth tearing open. When the smoke cleared, the bunker had collapsed inward, its log roof caved in, the machine gun silent. What Harper had just created wasn't in any manual, but it had saved his platoon and would soon change infantry tactics across 2 theaters of war. Within weeks, reports of unauthorized grenade clusters began appearing in after-action reports from Normandy to the Pacific. This was the moment American common sense outperformed official doctrine, when one sergeant's forbidden innovation became the bunker-busting tactic that would save thousands of lives and quietly reshape infantry training for the rest of the war. Chapter 1. The Bunker Problem. 3 weeks earlier, on June 15, 1944, Private First Class Robert Hendricks crouched behind a Norman hedgerow 9 miles inland from Omaha Beach, watching men he'd trained with for 18 months die in a field they couldn't cross. The hedgerow ahead looked like nothing special. 5 meters of bramble, earth, and ancient apple trees marking the edge of a farmer's pasture. But embedded in that vegetation, 40 yards across open ground, sat a German MG-42 machine gun nest that had already killed 11 men from Baker Company. Hendricks had seen 3 squads try to take it. The first charged straight across the field and were cut down before they made it halfway. The second attempted to flank left through a sunken lane and walked into a minefield. The third squad leader called for mortar support, but the rounds fell short or sailed over, exploding harmlessly in the next field. The bunker remained intact, its firing slit still spitting 200 rounds per minute at anything that moved. The Germans had spent 4 years preparing Normandy for exactly this moment. Their defensive positions weren't improvised foxholes. They were engineered fortifications designed by soldiers who understood that the Norman bocage transformed every field into a natural fortress. The bunkers were built from logs layered horizontally and packed with earth, sometimes reinforced with concrete stolen from Atlantic wall construction. The firing slits were angled to provide interlocking fields of fire with neighboring positions, creating kill zones where every square meter could be covered by at least 2 machine guns. German mortars, pre-registered on likely approach routes, could rain down fire within seconds of a radio call. And the hedgerows themselves, centuries-old earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, absorbed rifle fire and deflected grenades like medieval castle walls. The Mk2 fragmentation grenade, standard issue for U.S. infantry, was designed to kill exposed soldiers with shrapnel, not penetrate fortified positions. When American soldiers threw grenades at bunkers, they bounced off the logs or rolled down embankments, detonating harmlessly in the dirt. By late afternoon, a Sherman tank from the 2nd Armored Division arrived to support Baker Company's assault. The tank commander surveyed the bunker, positioned his vehicle, and fired 3 75mm high-explosive rounds directly at the log wall. The first 2 rounds splintered logs but didn't collapse the structure. The third punched through, and 30 seconds later, the German position fell silent. Hendricks and the survivors of Baker Company finally crossed the field and secured the objective. 18 men had died waiting for armor support that took 6 hours to arrive through the narrow, muddy lanes between hedgerows. 18 men whose training had prepared them for beach assaults and open field warfare, but not for this medieval siege combat where every pasture was a fortress and every hedgerow a wall. The victory felt hollow because Hendricks could see dozens more fields stretching towards St. Lo, each one bordered by hedgerows, each one potentially hiding another bunker. The 29th Infantry Division had advanced less than a mile in 3 days. At this rate, breaking out of Normandy would take months and cost tens of thousands of lives. Tank support worked when it arrived, but armor couldn't reach every position through the bocage's maze of sunken lanes, and infantry couldn't wait hours for heavy weapons every time they encountered a fortified bunker. Something had to change, and it wouldn't come from doctrine or training manuals. It would come from desperate men improvising solutions with whatever they had in their pockets, even if it meant breaking every regulation they'd been taught to follow. Chapter 2. Against the Rules. The first modification appeared on June 21, 1944, in the hands of Sergeant First Class Michael Torino, a squad leader with the 1st Infantry Division's 16th Regiment. Torino had read FM 23-30 during basic training at Fort Benning. The field manual was clear that grenades were not to be altered, combined, or modified in any way. The Mk2 fragmentation grenade was a precision instrument, its fuse timed to detonate 4.5 seconds after the safety lever released. Tampering with that timing, or wiring multiple grenades together, created unpredictable blast patterns and premature detonation risks that could kill the soldier attempting the modification. But Torino had also watched 6 men from his squad die trying to clear a bunker outside Trevieres using standard tactics, and doctrine hadn't brought any of them home. He worked in a drainage ditch behind friendly lines, away from officers who might order him to stop. 3 Mk2 grenades, their pineapple-textured cast iron bodies cool in his hands. Wire cutters from his combat vest, thin steel wire salvaged from a damaged fence. He threaded the wire through the pull rings, binding them together so that pulling one pin would arm all 3 grenades simultaneously. His hands shook slightly, not from fear of enemy fire, but from the knowledge that if he made a mistake, the blast would take his hands, his face, possibly his life. But the mathematics were simple. 3 grenades delivered 5 times the explosive force of 1, enough to collapse a log bunker or blow through a concrete firing port. It was also explicitly forbidden by every regulation he'd been taught. 2 hours later, Torino's improvised cluster worked exactly as he'd hoped. The German bunker that had stopped his platoon for 8 hours collapsed in a single explosion that sounded like thunder rolling through the hedgerows. His company commander asked where he'd learned the technique. Torino said he hadn't learned it anywhere. He'd figured it out because men were dying and the manual had no answers. The captain wrote it up in the after-action report as field expedient demolition, careful not to mention that it violated ordnance regulations. Within days, other sergeants in other companies began experimenting with similar modifications. Not all of them worked. On June 26th, Corporal James Dietrich of the 29th Infantry Division attempted to wire 4 grenades together using cord instead of wire. The cord caught on the safety lever of one grenade as he threw the bundle, pulling the pin prematurely. The explosion killed Dietrich instantly and wounded 2 soldiers standing nearby. His squad leader reported the incident as a grenade accident, leaving out the modification details to avoid a formal investigation. On July 2nd, a demolition team from the 4th Infantry Division tried attaching blocks of TNT to grenade clusters using blasting caps salvaged from engineer supplies. One detonated while the soldier was still assembling it, blowing off his right hand and part of his forearm. The medics saved his life, but he would never hold a rifle again. Yet despite the failures, despite the casualties, the modifications continued because they worked more often than they failed. Sergeants taught the techniques to corporals who taught them to privates. Some soldiers tied grenades to sticks or boards to create longer throwers that could reach bunker vents. Others used ration tin lids as makeshift timers, creating extended fuses that allowed grenades to penetrate deeper into fortified positions before detonating. Combat engineers began sharing demolition techniques with infantrymen, showing them how to properly wire explosive charges and set fuses. The innovation spread through unofficial channels, whispered conversations in foxholes, demonstrations during lulls between assaults. Knowledge passed from veteran NCOs to green replacements who arrived daily to fill the ranks of units that had taken 30, 40, 50% casualties. By mid-July, officers could no longer ignore what was happening. Company commanders saw the after-action reports. Battalion intelligence officers noted the increased success rate in bunker assaults, and some captains and majors, desperate to reduce casualties in their own units, quietly looked the other way when their sergeants violated regulations. But not all of them. On July 12th, a major from the Division Inspector General's office arrived at the 116th Infantry Regiment's headquarters, carrying copies of FM 23 or 30 and a list of soldiers reported for unauthorized ordnance modifications. Courts-martial were threatened. Confiscation of modified explosives was ordered. The message was clear: regulations existed for reasons, and soldiers who ignored them would face consequences, no matter how desperate the tactical situation. The question now was whether the Army would shut down the innovation that was saving lives, or whether common sense would finally overrule doctrine before more men died, following rules that didn't work. Chapter 3. The Pacific Connection. 7,000 miles across the Pacific, on September 17, 1944, Corporal Richard Krause of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines crouched behind a jagged outcrop of coral rock on Peleliu Island, watching Japanese machine gun fire tear through the men advancing ahead of him. The Marines had been told Peleliu would fall in 4 days. They were on day 2, and the 1st Marine Division had already taken over 1,100 casualties, trying to advance 300 yards inland from the beaches. The problem wasn't Japanese soldiers, it was Japanese engineering. The enemy had spent 2 years transforming Peleliu's Umabrogal Mountain into a fortress that made Normandy's bunkers look primitive by comparison. The Japanese defensive positions weren't built on the landscape, they were carved into it. Engineers had used mining tools to excavate firing positions directly into the coral limestone, creating interlocking networks of caves, tunnels, and bunkers that could withstand direct hits from naval artillery. Some positions sat 30 feet underground, connected by passages that allowed defenders to retreat, reposition, and counterattack without ever exposing themselves to American fire. The entrances were reinforced with coconut logs and steel rails, salvaged from mining equipment, then covered with coral rubble that absorbed shell fire like a sponge. Inside, Japanese soldiers waited with Type 92 heavy machine guns, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across every approach. Flamethrowers could clear these positions, but the Marine wielding a flamethrower had to get within 20 yards, close enough that Japanese defenders could often kill him before he could trigger the weapon. Krause watched as a flamethrower team from his company attempted to approach a bunker entrance. The Marine carrying the M22 flamethrower made it 15 yards before a burst of machine gun fire cut him down. The fuel tanks on his back didn't explode. That was a Hollywood myth. But 70 pounds of jellied gasoline gear made him an easy target, and he died without ever firing a shot. The assistant flamethrower operator tried to retrieve the weapon and was killed 30 seconds later. 2 men dead, the bunker still operational, and Krause's platoon was pinned down with no artillery support because the terrain made it impossible for forward observers to call in accurate fire. Then Sergeant Joseph McNamara, a combat engineer attached to the rifle company, crawled forward with a canvas satchel slung across his back. Inside the bag, 8 blocks of composition C4 plastic explosive, 2 blasting caps, and a pull igniter salvaged from demolition supplies. McNamara had learned the technique on Tarawa 9 months earlier, where Marines discovered that the M37 satchel charge, officially designed for destroying obstacles and bridges, could collapse cave entrances and seal Japanese defenders inside their own fortifications. He low-crawled to within 10 feet of the bunker entrance, pulled the igniter, and threw the 30-pound satchel directly into the firing port. The explosion sounded different than grenades, deeper, more forceful, a percussion wave that rattled teeth and compressed lungs. When the dust cleared, the bunker entrance had collapsed inward, tons of coral and reinforced timber sealing the position shut. The Japanese soldiers inside were either dead from the blast or trapped alive in a tomb of their own making. Krause and the surviving Marines pushed forward, securing the position and discovering something McNamara had already suspected. The innovation happening on Peleliu was identical to what was happening in Normandy, though neither theater knew about the other's tactics. In both places, NCOs facing impossible defensive positions had independently developed the same solutions. Explosive charges powerful enough to destroy fortifications that standard weapons couldn't touch. Some Marines wrapped grenades together with wire, creating clusters similar to what Sergeant Torino had invented in France. Others improvised satchel charges using whatever explosives they could scrounge from engineer supplies. The techniques spread through the same underground channels: squad leaders teaching platoons, veterans instructing replacements. Knowledge passed through demonstration rather than official training. But the innovation remained localized, confined to individual units that discovered the tactics through desperation and bloodshed. There was no systematic sharing of information between theaters, no official doctrine that captured what was working and disseminated it to troops who desperately needed it. Marines on Peleliu were reinventing solutions that Army infantry had perfected 2 months earlier in Normandy. Soldiers fighting through the Philippines would later rediscover the same techniques Marines had developed at Tarawa. And men continued to die, not because the solutions didn't exist, but because the military bureaucracy that could have spread those solutions across both theaters moved slower than the combat that demanded them. The question was whether that would change before the next island, the next bunker, the next group of young men who would have to learn these lessons in blood because no one had bothered to write them down. Chapter 4. Why the Manual Said No. Back in the United States, at the U.S. Army Ordnance School in Aberdeen, Maryland, Major William Forsyth sat in his office reviewing reports from Normandy and the Pacific with growing alarm. Forsyth had spent 15 years studying explosive safety, had written portions of FM 2330 himself, and understood exactly why the regulations existed. The prohibition against modifying grenades wasn't arbitrary bureaucracy. It was based on hard science and harder experience. Every year during the interwar period, soldiers had died in training accidents involving improvised explosives. Men who thought they understood blast dynamics had been killed by premature detonations. Others had been maimed by unpredictable fragmentation patterns when multiple grenades were wired together. The regulations in FM 23-30 had been written in blood, designed to prevent soldiers from killing themselves before they ever faced the enemy. The Mk2 fragmentation grenade was engineered with precise tolerances. Its cast iron body was segmented to produce predictable fragmentation, approximately 1,000 pieces traveling at lethal velocity in a 15-meter radius. The fuse assembly, a simple but reliable mechanism, used a striker spring released by removing the safety pin and releasing the spoon. Once released, a primer ignited a time delay element that burned for exactly 4.5 seconds before detonating the main charge. That timing was critical, long enough for the soldier to throw the grenade to safety, short enough that the enemy couldn't throw it back. When soldiers wired multiple grenades together, they disrupted these calculations. The combined blast created overpressure waves that could detonate adjacent grenades prematurely. Fragmentation. Patterns became chaotic and unpredictable. And if one fuse malfunctioned, the entire cluster could become a deadly liability in the soldier's hand. Forsyth had supervised explosive safety training at Fort Benning, where strict protocols had prevented the kind of accidents that had plagued earlier generations. Recruits learned to respect grenades as precision weapons, not toys to be modified. They practiced throwing techniques that maximized distance and accuracy. They understood blast radius calculations and learned to take cover immediately after release. The training worked. Accident rates during World War II remained lower than in previous conflicts, a testament to rigorous safety standards and clear regulations that left no room for improvisation. Those protocols had saved countless lives in training camps across America, preventing the kind of catastrophic accidents that could wipe out entire platoons before they ever saw combat. But Forsyth also understood that regulations written in peacetime couldn't account for combat realities no one had anticipated. FM 23-30 assumed grenades would be used against exposed enemy soldiers in trenches or open terrain, the warfare doctrine from World War I that still dominated U.S. Army thinking in the 1930s. No one had envisioned the kind of bunker warfare now consuming American forces in 2 theaters. The manual offered no solutions for reinforced log bunkers in Norman hedgerows or coral cave complexes on Pacific atolls. Standard grenades, used exactly as trained, were simply inadequate for the mission soldiers now faced. And the after-action reports piling up on Forsyth's desk told a story he couldn't ignore. Soldiers were dying because they followed doctrine, while those who broke the rules were surviving and winning battles. The data was undeniable. Units that employed improvised bunker-busting charges, grenade clusters, satchel charges, TNT attachments were clearing fortified positions faster and with lower casualties than units that relied on standard tactics and waited for armor or artillery support. Yes, some soldiers had been killed by premature detonations. Yes, the improvised devices were dangerous, but the casualty rates from failed frontal assaults using regulation equipment were far higher. Forsyth found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. The regulations he'd helped write were theoretically correct, but practically obsolete. The question wasn't whether the modifications were dangerous, they were. The question was whether they were less dangerous than the alternative of sending men into machine gun fire with inadequate tools. By October 1944, the weight of battlefield evidence had become impossible to dismiss. Reports from division commanders, battalion after-action summaries, even letters from field-grade officers all told the same story. Bunker-busting tactics worked, casualties were dropping in units that employed them, and soldiers would continue using these methods, regardless of what regulations said. The choice facing the Ordnance Department wasn't whether to allow innovation. That was already happening. The choice was whether to acknowledge it, study it, standardize it, and teach it safely so that fewer men would die learning techniques through trial and error. Forsyth began drafting recommendations for revisions to FM 23-30 and new training circulars that would incorporate field-expedient demolition tactics into official doctrine. But the process would take months, and in the meantime, men were still fighting, still improvising, and still dying in battles where the difference between victory and death often came down to whether their sergeant knew how to wire 3 grenades together without blowing himself up first. Chapter 5. Official Adoption. On November 15, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Morrison stood before a classroom of combat engineer instructors at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, holding a wire-bound grenade cluster that looked exactly like the forbidden devices sergeants had been building in Normandy since June. But this one was different. This cluster had been tested, documented, and approved by the Ordnance Department as a field-expedient demolition method, now authorized for instruction. Morrison, who had served as a battalion commander in France before rotating stateside to train replacements, knew he was witnessing something rare in military bureaucracy, the moment when the institution admitted it had been wrong and the soldiers had been right. The process had begun in early October when Major Forsyth's recommendations reached the desk of Brigadier General Levin Campbell, Chief of the Ordnance Department. Campbell ordered immediate field testing of the improvised bunker-busting techniques that had spread across 2 theaters. Combat engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground constructed replica German and Japanese fortifications, log bunkers modeled after Norman defensive positions, and reinforced concrete pillboxes mimicking Pacific Island fortifications. Then they tested everything soldiers had been doing in combat: 3 grenade clusters, 5 grenade clusters, TNT blocks attached to grenade bundles, satchel charges of varying compositions. They measured blast effects, fragmentation patterns, and structural damage. They documented failure rates and identified the modifications most likely to cause premature detonation. The results confirmed what battalion commanders had been reporting for months. Properly constructed grenade clusters, using wire rather than cord, and with pins linked to release simultaneously, produced significantly more destructive force than single grenades with acceptably low failure rates. 3 grenade clusters could collapse log bunkers that withstood direct mortar hits. 5 grenade clusters could breach reinforced concrete when placed against firing ports. Satchel charges containing 20 pounds of composition C could seal cave entrances or destroy bunker complexes entirely. Yes, the modifications were dangerous, but when soldiers were taught proper construction techniques, safety wire placement, and throwing methods, the accident rate was lower than the casualty rate from attempting frontal assaults with standard equipment. By December 1944, new training materials began circulating through replacement depots and combat engineer schools. Training Circular TC 23-7, titled Field Expedient Demolitions for Fortified Position Reduction, provided step-by-step instructions for constructing grenade clusters, complete with diagrams showing proper wire placement and safety procedures. A 16mm training film produced at the Army Pictorial Center in Astoria, New York, demonstrated the techniques using actors portraying combat engineers. The film showed not only successful employment, but also common mistakes, using cord instead of wire, failing to secure safety mechanisms, throwing clusters without proper technique. Replacement troops arriving in Europe and the Pacific in early 1945 received instruction in bunker-busting tactics as part of standard infantry training, learning in relative safety what earlier soldiers had discovered through trial, error, and blood. The validation came quietly, without fanfare or official acknowledgement that regulations had been inadequate. FM 23-30 itself wasn't revised. That would have required admitting the manual had been obsolete. Instead, the new techniques were classified as supplementary field procedures authorized for specific tactical situations. Officers who had threatened courts-martial in July were now teaching the same methods to replacement troops in December. Sergeant Harper's improvised cluster, Sergeant McNamara's satchel charge, and hundreds of similar innovations created by NCOs desperate to save their men were now official tactics, standardized and documented, for an army that had finally learned to listen to the soldiers who did the fighting. But the vindication carried a bitter weight. Between June and November 1944, thousands of American soldiers had died, attempting to clear fortified positions using inadequate standard tactics, while waiting for armor support that couldn't reach them through hedgerows or coral terrain. How many of those men would have survived if the Army had acknowledged the bunker problem sooner, tested solutions faster, and distributed training materials in July instead of December? How many Corporal Dietrichs had died from premature detonations because no one taught them to use wire instead of cord? How many platoons had been pinned down and slaughtered because their sergeants didn't know techniques that other units had perfected months earlier? The military had adapted, had listened to frontline innovation, had incorporated common sense into doctrine, but it had done so at the pace of bureaucracy while men died at the pace of combat. Sergeant Thomas Harper, the man who had violated FM 23-30 on July 14th outside St. Lo, would never know his innovation had become official doctrine. He was killed on August 3, 1944, during the breakout from Normandy, shot by a German sniper while leading his squad through a hedgerow outside Vire. His company commander mentioned the grenade cluster technique in the citation, recommending Harper for the Silver Star, noting that the sergeant's initiative and disregard for regulations in the face of enemy fire had saved numerous lives and enabled his platoon to accomplish its mission. The medal was awarded posthumously. By the time it reached Harper's widow in Pennsylvania, the technique he'd invented in a mud-slick ditch was being taught to every combat engineer in the U.S. Army, saving lives across 2 theaters in a war that still had 6 months to run. Chapter 6. The Cost of Innovation. Private Raymond Kowalski learned about improvised explosives the way most soldiers did in the summer of 1944, from a corporal who'd learned it from a sergeant who'd figured it out after watching half his squad die. On August 19th, outside the town of Falaise, France, Kowalski sat in a foxhole while Corporal Martinez showed him how to wire 3 Mk2 grenades together using steel wire salvaged from a fence. Martinez explained the importance of linking the pins so they'd all release simultaneously, demonstrated how to secure the safety levers, and emphasized the need to throw the cluster immediately after pulling the pin. What Martinez didn't know, because no one had taught him, because the knowledge existed only in scattered units across 2 continents, was that certain types of wire, particularly stranded wire, could catch on the safety lever during the throwing motion, creating exactly the kind of premature detonation FM 23-30 had warned against. 20 minutes later, Kowalski attempted to throw his first grenade cluster at a German position 60 yards away. The stranded wire he'd used caught on one of the safety levers as his arm came forward. The cluster detonated 18 inches from his hand. The explosion took his right arm below the elbow, shredded his face with fragmentation, and killed Martinez instantly. 2 other soldiers in the foxhole were wounded by shrapnel. Kowalski survived, barely, evacuated to a field hospital, where surgeons amputated what remained of his arm and removed 47 pieces of grenade fragments from his chest and face. He was 19 years old. His war ended because the knowledge of how to properly construct improvised explosives was spreading through whispered conversations and field demonstrations, not through systematic training that could have taught him the difference between solid core wire and stranded wire, between safe and lethal construction methods. The Army tracked these failures, though not always honestly. Some were reported as grenade accidents, without mentioning the modifications. Others were listed as combat casualties, lumped together with men killed by enemy fire, but battalion surgeons and company commanders knew the pattern. Between June and October 1944, an estimated 230 American soldiers were killed or seriously wounded by premature detonations of improvised explosives they had constructed themselves. Some used cord instead of wire. Others failed to properly secure multiple fuse assemblies. A few made the fatal mistake of attempting to construct satchel charges using captured German explosives whose properties they didn't understand. Each death represented a lesson that could have been taught safely in training, but instead was learned through trial and catastrophic error on battlefields where mistakes were measured in amputated limbs and flag-draped coffins. Yet the grim arithmetic of combat told a different story. Companies that adopted bunker-busting tactics, even with the risks of premature detonation, experienced 30 to 40% lower casualties during fortified position assaults than companies that relied solely on standard tactics. The 29th Infantry Division, which had taken horrific losses in the hedgerows of Normandy during June and July, saw casualty rates drop significantly in August after widespread adoption of grenade clusters and satchel charges. The 1st Marine Division on Peleliu, despite the brutal nature of cave warfare, achieved faster position clearance with fewer overall casualties once combat engineers taught systematic demolition techniques to rifle companies. The innovations worked. They saved more lives than they cost. But that statistical reality offered no comfort to men like Private Kowalski, who paid for the Army's slow adaptation with permanent disability, or to the families of soldiers like Corporal Martinez, who died teaching tactics that should have been in training manuals months earlier. Some soldiers faced consequences beyond physical injury. On July 28, 1944, 3 NCOs from the 4th Infantry Division were brought up on charges for violating ordnance regulations after an officer discovered them constructing grenade clusters behind the lines. The charges were serious: willful destruction of government property, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, possibly even reckless endangerment. The court-martial proceedings were scheduled for August 15th. On August 12th, the charges were quietly dropped without explanation. What had changed? Training Circular TC 23-7 was in final draft, and the Army could not court-martial soldiers for employing tactics it was about to officially authorize. The 3 sergeants returned to their units, their military records notation indicating only that charges had been administratively withdrawn. They would never know how close they came to federal convictions for innovations that would save thousands of lives in the coming months. The soldiers who died perfecting bunker-busting tactics don't appear in histories of tactical innovation. There are no monuments to Private Kowalski or Corporal Martinez, no memorials listing the 230 men who were killed by premature detonations while trying to save their squad mates. Their sacrifice was recorded in casualty reports, burial records, and disability pension files, bureaucratic documents that reduced complex human stories to cause-of-death codes and injury classifications. But their contribution was real. Every successful grenade cluster thrown in December 1944 by a replacement soldier who'd been properly trained at Fort Benning owed its existence to the NCOs who'd figured out the technique through experimentation in June. Every Marine who survived Iwo Jima because his sergeant knew how to properly construct a satchel charge benefited from the men who'd died learning those lessons on Peleliu. Innovation in war is always written in blood. The question is whether that blood purchases wisdom that gets shared, or whether each generation of soldiers must learn the same lessons through the same terrible mistakes. Chapter 7. Doctrine versus Reality. The story of improvised bunker-busting tactics revealed something deeper than tactical innovation. It exposed a fundamental difference in military culture that would help decide the outcome of World War II. In early 1945, as American forces prepared for the final assault on Germany and the invasion of Okinawa, military historians at the Army War College began analyzing why American forces consistently adapted faster to battlefield challenges than their German and Japanese opponents. The answer wasn't found in superior equipment or strategic brilliance. It was found in the willingness to trust sergeants like Thomas Harper to break regulations when doctrine failed. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with superior small unit tactics, battle-tested doctrine from the Spanish Civil War in Poland, and some of the most effective infantry weapons in the world. The MG-42 machine gun, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, and the STG-44 assault rifle represented technological advantages American forces couldn't match until late in the war. Yet by 1944, German forces were consistently losing tactical engagements, despite these advantages. The problem wasn't equipment, it was command culture. German military doctrine emphasized rigid adherence to established procedures, with innovation flowing from the top down through formal channels. When German NCOs encountered problems their training hadn't addressed, they were expected to request guidance from higher command rather than improvise solutions. This created fatal delays in adapting to battlefield realities and meant that tactical innovations remained isolated rather than spreading organically through the ranks. Japanese forces faced similar limitations. Their defensive engineering on Pacific Islands was superb. Their soldiers demonstrated extraordinary discipline and courage, and their tactics for fortified warfare were highly effective. But the Imperial Japanese Army's command structure was even more rigid than Germany's. Initiative at the NCO level, NCO, was actively discouraged. Innovation that contradicted established doctrine was viewed as insubordination. When American forces developed new tactics for clearing Japanese fortifications, the Japanese couldn't respond with counter-innovations because their system provided no mechanism for sergeants and junior officers to experiment with new solutions and share them laterally between units. Every tactical adaptation had to flow through formal command channels, which meant by the time new doctrine reached the front lines, American forces had already moved to the next innovation. American military culture, by contrast, empowered NCOs to act independently within the framework of mission-oriented orders. The principle, later formalized as mission command, but practiced informally throughout World War II, was simple. Tell soldiers what needs to be accomplished, provide them with resources and training, then trust them to figure out how. When Sergeant Harper wired 3 grenades together on July 14, 1944, he wasn't following doctrine. He was embodying a military culture that valued initiative over obedience, results over process, and solving problems over waiting for permission. His innovation spread not because higher command ordered it, but because other sergeants saw that it worked and adapted it to their own tactical situations. The U.S. Army's willingness to eventually validate these field-expedient techniques rather than court-martial the men who developed them reflected institutional flexibility that German and Japanese militaries simply could not match. The broader implications extended beyond grenade clusters. American forces consistently demonstrated faster tactical adaptation across every domain of warfare. When hedgerows proved impenetrable to tanks, Sergeant Curtis Coolin welded steel teeth to Sherman tank hulls, creating the Rhino tanks that broke the Normandy stalemate. When submarine warfare demanded faster convoy protection, the Navy rapidly developed and deployed escort carriers and destroyer escorts that transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. When close air support proved essential for infantry operations, forward air controllers, often junior officers with radio equipment, created tactical aviation coordination that German forces couldn't replicate. In every case, innovation originated from soldiers closest to the problem, then spread through informal channels before being formalized into doctrine. Sergeant Thomas Harper never knew his innovation would outlive him. His Silver Star citation, awarded posthumously, mentioned his exceptional courage and leadership, but said nothing about the tactical revolution he'd started. He was buried in the Normandy American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, one of 9,388 American soldiers resting beneath white crosses and stars of David overlooking Omaha Beach. But his legacy lived on in every combat engineer who learned proper bunker-busting techniques at Fort Belvoir, in every Marine who cleared a cave complex on Okinawa, in every soldier who survived, because an NCO had been empowered to question doctrine when reality demanded it. The grenade clusters weren't just weapons. They were proof that in war, the courage to think is as important as the courage to fight. The soldiers who won World War II weren't automatons following orders. They were citizens in uniform, entrusted with responsibility, expected to use initiative, and given the freedom to fail forward until they found solutions that worked. That cultural advantage, more than industrial capacity or technological superiority, was what defeated armies that valued obedience over innovation, doctrine over adaptation, and control over trust. The lesson remains relevant long after the last bunker fell silent. Wars are won not just by the soldiers willing to die for victory, but by the institutions willing to trust them to find new ways to live.